それでは、皆様、欧州ではおはようございます。日本でこんばんは。忙しいの中、メア・ブラウン法律事務所の2020年英国欧州エネルギー転換ウェビナーに参加いただいてありがとうございます。私は司会を務める東京事務所のルーパート・バローズでございます。短い時間ですが、これよりロンドン事務所の同僚が英国欧州のエネルギー転換についてお話を30分ほどした後に Q&A の時間を設けると思います。ご存知のようにロシアによるウクライナ攻撃が始まったので、それもどういう影響が出るかちょっと考えると思います。それではちょっと英語で同僚を紹介いたします。Okay, allow me, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, ladies and gentlemen who aren't Japanese, thank you for joining today, our second seminar in this series. Allow me to introduce our panelists today from the London office. We have Kirsty Massey, who's co-head of our infrastructure practice. We also have Meredith Campanale, also of the London office, and together with Miles Mantle, also in London. All three are actively engaged in renewables and hydrogen and other projects at the moment. So hopefully they'll be able to share some of their knowledge with you today. We do, at the end, as I mentioned in Japanese, we have questions and answers. There is a chat function, and if you would like to send questions in through that chat function, we'll be very happy to answer those at the end. So allow me to hand over to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupert, and it's a real pleasure to speak with you all today. Can I have the next slide, please? In terms of today's session, in the short time available, what we're going to do is take a quick look at what we mean by energy transition before then taking a closer look at some of the regulatory issues, both from a UK and a European perspective, with a particular focus on offshore wind, hydrogen, and carbon capture. We'll then go on to think about some of the financing issues that we're seeing in the context of the energy transition. We hope today to give you a flavour of some of the key areas of interest, as well as some of the things that we're seeing in the market, and also some of the tremendous opportunities that the energy transition presents. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So, whilst much of today's discussion and session is going to be focused on hydrogen, carbon capture, and also offshore wind, I think it's important to bear in mind that energy transition is in fact a much broader concept. As you'll see from this diagram, it includes lots of individual areas which are interlinked to give really a virtuous circle, if you like. So you've got renewable generation and storage, which of course includes offshore wind, but also batteries and hydrogen if it's being used in the storage context. You've got low carbon fuels, which will include hydrogen and e-fuels, carbon capture and storage. But there's also an energy efficiency demand side aspect to this, as well as the general electrification of our cities. Next slide, please. In terms of energy transition, as I said, we're going to focus on offshore wind, hydrogen, and carbon capture predominantly. In terms of UK offshore wind, the UK has a quite aggressive target of 40 gigawatts of installed offshore wind by 2040. The UK currently has about 9.8 gigawatts. So it's actually a very advanced market in the offshore wind space. It is a well-developed market, but it remains competitive and is a real focus of the UK government. We're currently in round 4 of our offshore programme, so that's involving offshore wind farms in much deeper waters and further offshore than was previously the case. 7 gigawatts of capacity is part of the round 4 tender in England and Wales, but we've just had the ScotWind announcement, which provided for 10 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity. That was announced, the bidders were announced in January of this year. That involves 17 projects in total, and I think it's fair to say it was a very successful auction round. What I think I'd just like to note in terms of ScotWind is that whilst 10 gigawatts of capacity was successfully bid for, 60 to 70% of that capacity is actually floating offshore wind. And that's a real trend that we're seeing both in the UK and Europe. And I think what's particularly interesting is that floating technology is also the technology which I think is of particular interest in the context of the Japanese offshore wind sector and also the US offshore wind sector, given the geographical nature of the offshore landscape in both those locations. Staying with offshore wind, we're also involved in the OFTO tender round 9 that was launched in January this year. OFTO, of course, is the offshore transmission regime. So the transmission links that connect the offshore wind platforms to the onshore system. In the UK, those links have typically been built by project developers, but once they're built and the wind farm goes into operation, the licensing regime is such that the transmission infrastructure then is spun off, is auctioned separately. I think, again, just to note here that to date, offshore transmission has really been approached on a sort of project by project basis, and that's being looked at quite carefully by Ofgem, the regulator in the UK, and they are considering a more coordinated strategy, given the fact that the sort of now that offshore wind is looking further offshore, transmission becomes a little bit more complex. We've also had a number of issues in the UK around the cumulative impact of the offshore transmission arrangements, particularly in the onshore when they come onshore. So that's driving a discussion around whether offshore transmission should be more coordinated. Next slide, please. Just to touch briefly on the process, there are 5 stages to the process in the UK offshore space. And I think this process is one that we see sort of replicated by and large in various jurisdictions in Europe. In terms of round 4, we're currently in the Habitats Regulation Assessment process. The announcement of that assessment is expected in spring this year. Just by way of background, that assessment is something that's undertaken by the Crown Estate, which in the UK is the entity that owns the sort of seabed and the offshore area. And it looks at the impact that the offshore wind has on protected areas. It's a process that typically takes about 12 months. But as I said, we're expecting the outcome of that assessment for round 4 in the next couple of months. Once you've got a successful habitats regulation assessment, you then go on to the agreement to lease, whereby those successful bidders in the auction rounds get the actual agreements. Next slide, please. In terms of hydrogen, before getting into the UK strategy, I just want to mention briefly the European strategy. It's fair to say that there is a strategy in Europe at a European level. So that's really quite high-level principles as to the approach the EU wants to take to the development of hydrogen. But a couple of things to note, that whilst there is this high-level EU strategy, the detail of how that is rolled out and implemented is done at an individual member state level. So individual member states, France, Germany, etc., will have their own hydrogen strategies and frameworks for implementing those strategies. It's also worth noting, I think, that in the European context, the taxonomy, which is a word that everybody uses, but basically means the terminology and the concepts, is slightly different. So in Europe, you talk about clean hydrogen production and renewable hydrogen production, whereas in the UK, for example, you talk about green hydrogen being renewables hydrogen and blue hydrogen being hydrogen that is typically linked with carbon capture and storage. So whilst we have this EU strategy, there are a number of other aspects of EU regulation that I do think it's important to reference in the hydrogen context. And they will be relevant, I think, as these hydrogen projects get rolled out. You've got the TENI regulations, whereby projects of European interest are given the TENI sort of stamp, if you like, and that really helps in terms of the licensing and permitting process. And I think that's something that Miles is going to talk about a little bit later in the context of carbon capture. You've also got the principles of the third energy package, which I think the key concept here will be third-party access to key infrastructure. Also, state aid shouldn't be forgotten, because a number of these hydrogen projects in particular will have government support. So the nature of that government support will need to be assessed from a state aid perspective. But looking in a little bit more detail at the UK strategy, as I said, the UK is looking at 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen production by 2030. So that includes green hydrogen and blue. So both renewable sources and hydrogen that is linked with carbon capture and storage. There is a twin track approach, but there's also what's called a low regrets approach by the government. So there is support across different industries and different technologies. On a more granular level, the UK government wants to have 1 gigawatt of production in place by 2025. There are a number of funds that are being set up to support hydrogen development. Particularly the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund is being earmarked to capital co-fund and support some engineering studies. But I'd like to look in a little bit more detail and focus on the hydrogen business model and what that means, because essentially that's a package of measures that is looking to provide a long-term revenue support mechanism to really stimulate investment in hydrogen. It's still at the consultation paper stage, but I think what is interesting is key to the business model. At the center of it at the moment is a focus on price and volume risk and the role that a form of CFD, so a contract for difference, the type of contractual arrangement and support that we see in the offshore sector, how that can assist. And there are a couple of things I think that's interesting to think about in terms of the CFD for hydrogen. The first is the mechanic of a CFD talks about a strike price and the reference market price. Now, of course, in the hydrogen space, you don't have a developed market. So question how you go about ascertaining the market price. Now, the UK government's thinking is that you may look at the gas market price and until such time as there is an established hydrogen market. That's interesting, given where wholesale gas prices are currently and what the long-term sort of forward curve wholesale gas price is going to look like. There's also a discussion around whether the CFD should be structured to provide a sliding scale price to reflect the fact that project developers will need to recover fixed costs at an early stage in the project where perhaps the volume of revenue sales is pretty low. So again, the CFD is the starting point, but it may be tweaked a little to really try and address some of the key issues that arise in the context of hydrogen projects. Next slide, please. In the UK, the key strategy is around hydrogen clusters. We have 6 clusters in the UK, all around the coast. So again, I think that emphasizes the link to offshore wind and renewable energy strategy generally. And Meredith will talk a little bit more around clusters and what that means in the financing context. There's also a focus on downstream market development. And there are 3 main elements to this: transportation, We already have sort of quite a lot of small scale hydrogen use in transportation, but there's a real focus on shipping and aviation. And in this context, e-fuels is particularly important. And that's something that we're really seeing quite a lot of activity in. Power generation. Low carbon hydrogen is seen as playing a very important role in flexible power generation and storage. That's particularly important as the amount of renewables in the energy mix increases. We're also looking at blending hydrogen in the gas networks with a project underway that's looking at whether we can blend up to 20% of hydrogen in the gas network. Next slide, please. In terms of the regulatory framework, I'm going to look mainly at the UK, but the situation in Europe is pretty similar in that very, very few jurisdictions, if any, have specific regulatory frameworks that have been developed to address hydrogen. What we're seeing is a reliance on existing energy regulatory frameworks and planning regimes. So that may give rise to a slightly fragmented approach. But having said that, what we are able to do is rely on a tried and tested regulatory regime. So in the UK, you've got the Gas Act. The concept of natural gas includes hydrogen. But what it does mean then is that if you're involved in the hydrogen space, you will be subject to the licensing regime that applies to gas activities in the UK. You will also come under the network code and retail energy code requirements. You'll also be required to comply with the gas safety regulations. And that's quite interesting because currently, as a matter of gas safety, you are only permitted to have 0.1% of hydrogen blended with the natural gas in the transportation network. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the projects that's being considered is whether you could blend up to 20% of hydrogen in the gas network. So if we go down that route, the UK will need to amend its gas safety regulations. Next slide, please. The planning regulatory framework will also be relevant. So many of these hydrogen and energy transition projects, including carbon capture, are significant infrastructure. So they come under the development consent order regime, which is a streamlined planning regime. Smaller projects, however, may find themselves under the Town and Country Planning Act. Environmental impact assessments will be required typically. Now, I mentioned in the offshore context this issue around cumulative impact and how that needs to be considered from an environmental impact assessment perspective. I do think that that's going to be very relevant in the context of hydrogen clusters and also carbon capture clusters, because you've got this accumulation of heavy sort of infrastructure in a fairly limited area. The health and safety regulatory regime will also be relevant, of course, as will the international carriage of dangerous goods. And that's a European regime which continues to apply in the UK and does have implications as to the routes that can be used for the transportation of hydrogen. So as you can see, there is a real starting point for the regulatory framework to accommodate hydrogen in particular in the UK. And that's important. And I think it's also something that strikes me as quite interesting. But the places where, the jurisdictions where we're seeing really initial activity are those jurisdictions where there is an established comprehensive energy regulatory regime. Next slide, please. So that takes us on to carbon capture strategy, and I'll hand over to Miles to talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you very much, Kirsty, and it's a pleasure to be speaking to you all today. So in terms of the carbon capture strategy, you know, in any net zero or low carbon emissions strategy, carbon capture obviously is important. particularly on the basis of certain industries, for example, cement manufacturing, steel industry, even waste to power, and blue hydrogen as well, where carbon capture becomes necessary, and it's not possible to eliminate carbon from the value chain. So the actual strategy and regulatory environment in terms of carbon capture is quite a long way behind certainly renewables, but even hydrogen strategies. However, last year there was quite a lot of activity in the UK, in particular the BEIS, the Department of Business, Energy and Infrastructure Strategy, published the carbon capture cluster sequencing strategy, which involves the idea of having 4 carbon capture hubs by 2030. There's 2 tracks to that. The track 1 involves 2 carbon capture projects to be deployed by the mid-2020s. And as Kirsty mentioned about CFD type contracts, actually, in terms of carbon capture, BEIS has actually published what are considered standard type CFD contracts. I'll go into those in a bit more detail in the context of financing these projects. In terms of actually awarding the projects, there's certain strict criteria. These include, they've got to be UK based, and I'll go on to the transnational basis of carbon capture projects later. But also the carbon capture projects need to be associated with existing cluster projects. Now, out of those 6 projects that Kirsty mentioned earlier, 2 I think are being designated as in terms of the cluster sequencing. So potentially the 2 projects for the mid-2020s have to be associated with those 2 transmission and storage projects that are being developed at the moment. Looking around Europe, there's currently there are about 40 projects being developed. In Norway, one of the sort of the main hubs, I suppose, is the Longship Project in Norway. Here, there's a sort of direct negotiations with government in terms of feasibility studies, determining location, etc., etc. And the government Norwegian government is providing capital support as well as operations support for up to 10 years for this Longship project. Moving on to the EU, and again, as Kirsty mentioned, I'll talk a little bit about 10E regulations. The 10E regulations have been developed over the years for the Trans-European Energy Network, and this is generally for sort of energy distribution. There is an issue, potentially an issue with carbon capture projects, in that the EU Commission has determined that parts of carbon capture projects, including the storage and transport that's not through pipelines, may not necessarily be applicable to the 10E regulations. So there's quite a lot of discussion going on in the EU context about how carbon capture storage, long-term storage, as well as temporary storage fit and transport potentially through liquid CO2 vessels fits into the 10E regulations. If carbon capture projects are able to achieve or to be, the 10E regulations can apply to them, then the idea is that they can get projects common interest status, which, as Kirsty already mentioned, allows for accelerated planning and development, as well as access to the Connecting Europe Fund, and again for capital payments, as well as potentially operational support. There's plenty of other funds that are available on the EU level, but the complicating factor is, again, each particular jurisdiction within the EU has its own funds, and so it's certainly unclear right now in terms of access to what development funds are available. Next slide, please. At this point, I think I'll hand over to Meredith. I'll come back later.
Thank you, Miles. Could I have the next slide, please? So I will be focusing on hydrogen finance, and then Miles will discuss carbon capture and storage and what we're seeing in that space. In terms of hydrogen finance, I thought it might be useful to just take a quick look from a very high level at the state of the investment that will be needed in the hydrogen space. And for these purposes, I'm focusing on blue and green hydrogen, or what some taxonomies call low carbon hydrogen. There was a report from the Hydrogen Council and McKinsey that came out in 2021 that tried to give an estimate of the amount of investment that would be needed. And they are projecting hydrogen investment of more than $300 billion through 2030. Now that's a really big number. But if you actually drill down and look at what they are talking about, the figure includes a tally of project announcements, investments required to reach government production targets, and spending projections across the value chain. So clearly there are a lot of things in that figure that are tentative, that may not come to pass. So I think we have to view that figure with a degree of I wouldn't say skepticism, but certainly moderation. If you look at the estimates for mature investments, according to the report, that's closer to $80 billion. But then if you look, they've broken it down into planning stage investments and realized stage investments. Planning stage being where feasibility studies are being undertaken, where there's a FEED study. So that is still very much at the early stages of any sort of investment. Realized stage investments, they're saying that's about $38 billion, and that's where FID has been taken or the investment is under construction or operational. So I think that gives you a bit of a sense, but one thing that they have said in the report is that 75% of these investments involve announcements, but not committed funding. So again, all of the things that are announced are not necessarily going to proceed. But hopefully this gives you kind of a flavor of the potential scope of the sector here that we're talking about. There have been, according to this report, 17 announced gigascale production projects, and gigascale is renewable hydrogen greater than 1 gig and low carbon hydrogen greater than 200 KTPA. I would say clearly we're at the beginnings of a nascent market, and there is an opportunity for pathfinder companies and projects here. And I think what developers are doing at this stage, certainly what we're seeing and hearing from talking to them, is that they're infilling skills and creating teams at the moment to gear themselves up for these investments that will need to be made. Next slide, please. So how are the projects that are happening being funded? Well, primarily, these projects are being funded by equity for the moment, and they're very much on balance sheet. I think it's fair to say that at this stage, given how nascent the market is, that government subsidies and incentives are playing a large role. And we'll talk a little bit about the role of governments in just a moment and in the sorts of support that they can provide. Project finance is very limited at present. It is tricky for various reasons, which we'll go on to discuss. But I think it's fair to say that we're not seeing limited recourse project finance at the moment. However, there are a lot of deals that are under development, and certainly our team is looking at those. And I know from speaking to participants in the market that those deals are being contemplated. But in terms of closed deals, it's very limited at the moment. Looking at project finance, why is it limited at the moment? Well, there are a number of risks in the hydrogen space that need to be considered and mitigated. And we'll go on to discuss those on the next slide, and we'll drill down in a bit more detail. But I think financiers are proceeding with caution. Credit committees need to be persuaded. And people are thinking at a high level about how to structure these projects and ways in which the risks can be mitigated. One thing that I do want to focus on is the role of what I'll call blended finance in de-risking hydrogen projects. Blended finance is usually used in a development finance context, and the way that it is usually defined is a combination of concessional or development financing and commercial funding. And the goal of the concessional or development funding is to mitigate specific investment risks and to help projects get off the ground that may be unable to proceed on strictly commercial terms. Here, the way that I would use it is bringing together public capital and private funding through a common investment structure. So when I say blended finance here, I basically mean using public funding tools to help encourage the growth of investment in the sector by private sector participants. What might blended finance look like in hydrogen projects? Well, government support is clearly key. We're seeing public budgets being used to harness private funding. We're seeing policy support that is being used to basically pull investments across the value chain. And this could be in the form of grants. It could be investments by the government in certain projects. It could be incentives, such as tax incentives, or it could be things like CFDs, and Kirsty spoke about that early on, and the questions that need to be worked out for a hydrogen CFD regime. We could also see development finance institutions and multilateral banks supporting these projects. The sorts of support that they would provide in this kind of model would be de-risking investments through things like first loss or venture debt, equity investments, loans, guarantees, insurance, and even technical assistance. And then finally, what is interesting about the hydrogen sector is that it's potentially creating new supply chains, which also creates opportunities. So we will likely see export credit agencies, for example, JBIC and Nexi, who you're very familiar with, getting involved, and they will provide loans and guarantees to support hydrogen-related exports. One interesting trend that we've seen in the export finance space recently is that they are starting to support domestic energy transition projects and the creation of green supply chains domestically. And hydrogen could very much be part of this. So I think I think that it's fair to say that we will see a lot more blended finance going forward, and a lot of the projects that have been closed currently utilize these various types of public capital to sort of get things moving. Next slide, please. So looking at some of the challenges to hydrogen finance, I've listed a number of them here. There are certainly others as well, but I thought it might be worth going through a couple of these points and letting you know what we've been hearing from banks and developers in terms of what is challenging in this space. The first thing is scaling and cost issues. This has been described by Irena as a chicken and egg scenario. So without sufficient demand, investments remain too risky for widespread investment that could reduce production costs. But without economies of scale, then the technology remains too costly. And it's also important to note here that we're talking about building a new ecosystem, not just hydrogen production, but we're also talking about transport and storage. So we're talking about large-scale investments needed here, which is very expensive. For financiers, it's actually hard to model or predict certain costs. So when you're looking at potentially providing financing to a project and you're trying to put together the financial model, it's difficult to model things like the costs of environmental regulation because that's changing, customer demand, price, etc. So that does create challenges in terms of identifying the costs. Technology risk. Here, just to say that blue hydrogen in particular suffers from this, and high carbon capture rates are yet to be demonstrated at scale. So, there's an element of technology risk here. Additionally, putting all of the technology in the value chain together is pretty tricky and hasn't been done yet at scale. So that the technology risk is something that needs to be considered. There's a very complex value chain, and that contributes to cost, as explained above. But also there is a big question of project on project risk. So when you're putting together a lot of different elements, assuming that the same party is not developing and financing all of these elements of the chain, you're talking about what we would call a non-integrated financing model. So for example, in green hydrogen, that would be where the power supply for the electrolyzer is developed and financed by a different entity than is financing the electrolyzer itself. And that creates risks, and those need to be addressed and mitigated. Performance risk. In this space, there's a need to build up experienced contractors, operators, etc. Now, there are clearly skill sets and there's expertise from other sectors as well, but specific to hydrogen, that still has, those skills still have to be developed. Offtake risk is a big factor. So there's not a liquid market for hydrogen. The market infrastructure is not in place. There's not a very standard form of hydrogen purchase agreement yet. So dealing with that is going to be something that developers and financiers will think about. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Regulatory and change in law risk. It's obviously an evolving sector and the regulatory landscape will change with it. Kirsty spoke very well previously about the regulatory framework. And one of the things that she mentioned is that countries are trying to use existing regulatory frameworks and apply them to hydrogen. In some countries, the regulatory frameworks are actually being created. So that is one area where it's tricky to know how things will evolve over time. And then finally, I'll speak very briefly about stranded asset risk, which is a very interesting concept. This is the risk that assets tied to carbon might be in trouble as markets head towards renewable energy. And basically, this is something that was flagged by the former Bank of England Governor, Mark Carney, and he described it as the costs and benefits of tomorrow informing the investment and credit decisions of today, which I thought was a very interesting way of phrasing it. There was a report that came out from IRENA in January that suggested that investments in blue hydrogen will be riskier over time because the expected cost reduction in green hydrogen by 2030 means that green hydrogen will be more competitive and that there will also be increasing regulation of blue hydrogen. So if you're looking at a return on equity investment over the long term and your debt that you're seeking gets amortized over many years, then this viewpoint suggests that blue hydrogen investments may be more risky than green in the long term. That's just a viewpoint, but it is something interesting to think about. So I think the question for developers and for financiers is really, how do you make this work? Well, I think we all have the toolkit that we need. I don't think hydrogen projects are really that different from other large energy projects when you think about it. I don't think it requires novel structuring to get these projects off the ground. I do think it requires using the toolkit that we already have. But I do think that at this stage, what we're seeing is that convincing credit committees is a challenge. There's a little bit of a leap of faith here that credit committees have to make. And so I think we will see hydrogen finance coming along, but it's just, getting those initial projects going. Next slide, please. So here are some viewpoints that we have based on our experience in the space. And, it's early days for this sector, but we did think that it was worth trying to pull together some of our observations from, speaking to clients in this space. There are certain hydrogen projects that are shaping up to be early bets in the finance space as we see it. So the first is industrial clusters. And hydrogen hubs, which Kirsty spoke about. Basically, the reason that these are more financeable is because you have supply and demand in the same place. And in terms of the question about offtake risk, this helps to mitigate that, and it's very helpful. So certainly that is why governments are encouraging these sorts of projects, because they know that these are going to be easier to get off the ground and to finance. Blending is also another area where we will see early investments. So, and this is something that's happening a lot in the Japanese market and elsewhere as well. But this is a sort of transitory proposition, I would say. But certainly, blending type projects are ones that we think could be financed early on. And then blue hydrogen also seems like a good early bet. And it's more of a medium-term proposition to sort of scale up the hydrogen economy, to repurpose existing infrastructure. And that is one area that we're hearing a lot about from banks who are looking to get involved in the space. There will be variation between regions. So for example, if you look at Japan, the green growth strategy in Japan is focused on ammonia, shipping, fuel cells, electric vehicles, things like that. Japan leads in the global deployment of micro cogeneration fuel cells in buildings. So there are areas where different countries, different regions may have expertise. Perhaps in other regions like Africa, you would see a green hydrogen play given ample renewable energy sources. In the US, maybe it's a gas play, carbon capture and storage, but also some green hydrogen. So on the next slide, but please don't move yet. On the next slide, we have a bit of a comparison of different national strategies, and I think it illustrates that there will be some variation here, and therefore there will be variation in the different types of projects that are financed between regions. And one point to note is that financiers will be attracted by strong sponsors. That helps to de-risk investments. We're seeing a lot of JV formation at the moment. And one of the things that is interesting in the hydrogen space is that it's what I would call a patchwork of skills. So you have some people bringing the financial wherewithal, the expertise in the energy sector. You have others bringing the new technology. So, keep an eye on that space. I think it's all part of a bigger play in the energy transition space. And there will be first mover advantages, and the pace to market is a key differentiator. So, getting JVs set up and getting them moving is very important. And then finally, blended finance will be critical for some time. So as I explained before, the role that governments, development finance institutions, ECAs play is critical in terms of getting financing going in the sector, helping to bring in private capital. So next slide, please. And this is just a comparison of different national strategies. The slides, I believe, will be circulated after this talk, but I won't go into detail, but you can see that there are slight differentiators between different countries, different regions in terms of what they're looking at for end uses and targets, and the types of technology that they're looking at, the emphasis there. So that is all very interesting. And I think what it shows you is that, in terms of financing, that there may be differences between countries and regions. Next slide, please. I'll hand it over to Miles. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Meredith. I think we're somewhat running out of time, so I'll be brief on the next few slides. This slide just shows it's a map showing there are actually 40 projects being proposed or under development around Europe. Of particular note or interest are the large green circles, one on the west of Norway, which is the Longship Project I mentioned earlier, which is basically it's a idea to capture carbon emissions from cement plants, steel manufacturing, and other industries around the Oslo area to ship them to the Northern Lights receiving terminal, which then pipes the carbon dioxide offshore for long-term storage in depleted reservoirs under sea. Other projects to particularly note are Porthos in the port of Rotterdam, C4 in Copenhagen, then HyNet in the UK, and the East Coast Humber and Teesside projects, where for Porthos and C4, they're predominantly carbon capture storage, whereas sort of HyNet and East Coast are it's both sort of industrial clusters, as has been mentioned earlier, hydrogen production with associated carbon capture and storage. In these slides, actually, there's a lot more emphasis on the storage aspect. There's a little discussion on use, because around Europe that's not necessarily so developed. This is in compare contrast with US, where a lot of carbon capture projects associated with associated carbon capture projects have one of the revenue streams is enhanced oil recovery. there's little development in that aspect around Europe. Potentially, we may see that somewhat in the future. Next slide, please. So this is a diagram of the HyNet project, Chester, Liverpool, Manchester. And actually, we thought helpful to show the complexity of the hydrogen value chains that Meredith has talked about, and how the issues that are going to be associated with delivering all the different aspects of this project. But in the red circle is the carbon captured storage aspects. There's both the deep sea and the undersea storage with pipeline from the hydrogen production and potentially other industries. But also there is a sort of vessel there where the idea potentially being to transport carbon captured from industrial emissions elsewhere. And this actually is rather interesting in the context of how that works in terms of various regulations, and if the transport element is covered, as I mentioned earlier, in the context of the TENI regulations in the EU. Next slide, please. So moving on to comparison of revenue models for carbon capture and storage, as has been mentioned already, in the UK model, the BEIS have published sort of standard contracts for various different carbon capture type projects, and it's a type of CF contracts for difference. As Kirsty's already mentioned, the idea here is you get there's a strike price, you get paid the difference between the strike price. Now, in the context of carbon capture projects, the difference is between the price that is available from selling emissions certificates to the strike price. And this is the sale of emission certificates from the actual producer or the emitter of the carbon, not actually the storage entities. So what's quite interesting is the idea of where, say, for example, in HyNet, Eni is entered into an MOU to carry out storage functions, but it's not the actual emitter. So therefore, there needs to be a subcontract for payment to Eni as the capture as a service provider, whereas the emitter entered into a CFD type contract with the low carbon contracts company in the UK. And this actually, because the structure is under development, it's not clear how this works, and will take some work to analyze and to ensure that there is a bankable structure there. Porthos in the Netherlands, there's a similar structure. Again, there's an element of the strike price as against the price achievable on the emissions trading scheme. Now, there's also in these contracts there's a capital element as well as an OPEX pricing. In terms of the Longship project in Norway, the idea there is that it's carbon capture as a service. So query how the different revenue streams work. It's not yet clear. And as mentioned, in future potentially there's other revenue streams from enhanced oil recovery or potentially mixing with for production of biofuels. One question I think that arises is in terms of how that works. If there's long-term storage and then determine that there's actually other revenue streams, does that work together? A lot of analysis needs to be done in connection with that. Yeah, please compare and contrast, with the US position, where I think there's a number of successfully delivered carbon capture projects where they utilize tax credits. 45Q, I think, is the relevant tax credit that applies for carbon capture and storage projects, as well as sort of combining with revenue from enhanced oil recovery and potentially stacking up together with other statewide credits that are available. Next slide, please. So this is somewhat going over the same subject area that Meredith spoke about in the context of hydrogen projects. Currently we're seeing that there's a lot of work being done, a lot of development in terms of carbon capture connected to industrial cluster projects, and those are the main sort of the main focus of attention at the moment, certainly in the UK. There's a lot of sort of work development being done in connection with carbon capture storage hubs, where there may be a transnational element with sort of industrial projects with associated carbon capture, the need to transport to a suitable carbon capture hub where actually the carbon can be stored, for example, in depleted oil fields or offshore or even onshore. There is obviously some of the projects being developed around Europe are carbon capture connected with production, including for power as well as cement and steel, etc., etc. As for hydrogen, it's quite a lot of strong sponsor support at present. And as Meredith mentioned, in the context of hydrogen, joint ventures being formed, for example, in Longship, Equinor have formed a joint venture with Shell and Total. ENI is participating in the HyNet project. Again, the fact that equity may be used for initial developments together with blended finance government support is going to be critical for some time, but and query, at what stage does project finance come in? And then the idea of potential revenue streams outside of the CFD type of contract needs to be considered and potentially developed. And there's it's all very unclear right now how those extra revenue streams will work as against the current structures for CFD contracts and government support, etc., etc. Next slide, please. And this I won't go over this because I think we're somewhat out of time, but this is just in the context of transport. There is obviously Longship have ordered 2 liquid CO2 carriers. Various other liquid CO2 carriers are in development. Query whether government support is available for reasons mentioned earlier for financing these. There is obviously an increasing amount of green finance available both from banks and funds for the shipping world, but connected with new technology risk. I think some of the CO2 carriers for the Longship project are LNG powered, so there's obviously technology risk there, and so forth. Next slide, please. So yes.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Miles. We are running out of time, and we have got some good questions that have been coming through. So maybe if we can just jump onto a few of those. The first one that was asked was if there's a coordinated grid in the future and the Pathfinder, should it be the same OFTO model? If so, who builds it? National Grid or public company? Or should it be build, own, operate? How is Ofgem's thinking? What is MB's view on the regulation? Who would like to take up that one? Kirsty.
Shall I have a go at that?
Sure.
I think so. It's interesting. I think there's a lot of discussion ongoing. I don't think there is a clear answer as yet. I think that the issue does need to be dealt with on a more coordinated basis, particularly given the fact that the new wind farms are being certainly in the UK or further offshore. I also think there's a lot of discussion around interconnection offshore with other transmission systems in Europe. So you create more of an integrated offshore transmission system. And indeed, that's not just a UK issue, that's something that we're seeing discussed in the context of the Baltics. That in terms of what's the right approach, I suspect it won't be if I were, my honest opinion, and this is my own personal opinion, I'm not saying it's correct, but I suspect it will be private entities that will the government will look to build the infrastructure, as opposed to national grid. Certainly the off-take model so far has been quite successful. Whether or not it becomes a build, own, operate model, I think depends to some extent on whether, on the nature of the offshore grid as a whole, and whether when we talk about a coordinated approach, we're not just talking about multiple connections to sort of a set of wind farms, we're looking at more of an integrated system. But I do wonder if the sort of build, own, operate is perhaps the better way forward. That having been said, it does create tensions and risk around the contractual interface and delay in terms of grid connection and the offshore wind farm development itself.
Great, thank you, Kirsty. Next question that's come in is actually relates to the nuclear sector. What's your observation about the UK's energy strategy on the nuclear plant? UK's announced end of last year it would invest £1.7 billion to Sizewell. Are they looking for their energy strategy as their priority or as their supplement? And how about other EU countries and their strategies? For example, France, which has an extensive fleet, and Germany, which has given up its nuclear plant.
Shall I have a go at that one as well?
Sure.
Yes, nuclear is an important part of the UK's energy strategy. I think given security of supply considerations, there's a real drive to have a mix of generation within the energy portfolio, and nuclear is included within that. I think whether or not it's a priority, I'm not so sure it's a priority, but it is an important aspect of the UK's energy strategy. I think there are a number of sensitivities around that. Clearly, the cost of nuclear and the long build time raises issues in terms of energy pricing. And that's a particular sensitivity in a number of markets in Europe at the moment, given the high wholesale energy price. That being said, it could be an argument for actually continuing to move away and diversify the energy generation mix. I think that something that is indicative of continued support for nuclear as well is that the regulator over the last few years has approved, and at a sort of a high level as opposed to specific project level, particular nuclear technologies. So, and I think that's the case not just in the UK, but in Europe more generally. As mentioned, France has a large nuclear fleet, and I think my understanding is that there is a continued commitment and interest to nuclear in France, particularly given that a number of the nuclear assets were on outage fairly recently, last year, that contributed to increases in energy prices. So I think the role of nuclear is considered important in France. Germany has indeed committed to not building its own nuclear. That being said, given the interconnected nature of the European transmission network, clearly Germany does benefit from megawatts that potentially originate from nuclear plant in other jurisdictions. Then finally, just quickly, in terms of other European jurisdictions, there are a number of jurisdictions that continue to be interested in nuclear, including the Nordics and Eastern Europe. So, for example, jurisdictions such as Poland, the Czech Republic continue to discuss and consider nuclear. I suppose one thing we do need to think about is that given the current situation that we find ourselves in, there will be increased sensitivity, I think, to the perception of nuclear plant generally, and also I question whether there will be any appetite for Russian nuclear technology in the areas we've discussed, and the role that sanctions will have to play.
Thanks, Kirsty. Maybe allow me just jump in on that one as well. I think there's a clear trend as well in the nuclear sector. Traditional plants are so expensive, sort of north of $20 billion. There's now a strong focus on modular nuclear reactors. At the end of last year, the British government invested, I think it was about £200 million into the Rolls-Royce unit that is developing modular reactors. Those reactors are likely to be in the roughly perhaps 2 billion rather than 20 billion. Each of them would power potentially 1 million UK homes. So that investment is going on in parallel in the States. There's NuScale, again, developing modular reactors. So I think we spoke about stranded cost of some of these projects. If you develop a massive nuclear power plant, there is risk in the future that the cost of renewables has come so far down to actually put them out of business. So, I mean, obviously those projects get locked into very long-term contracts. If it's done on a smaller scale, it's much more manageable, and that seems to be the way that people are heading. One other question, and I think we are probably going to then wrap it up because I noticed people are dropping off. Have got other commitments, I believe. One question came through: what are we seeing in our practice as the areas that we're being instructed on that are actually sort of leading? Where is the market going at the moment, and what are we seeing in terms of where the work is, where the projects are?
So I'll jump in quickly, and then Meredith and Miles, and I will be brief on this given the time. Certainly from my perspective, as mentioned, floating offshore is a real focus in the UK and Europe. So a lot of activity in that space. E-fuels as well, a very active area with hydrogen playing an important role in terms of feedstock there. Those projects are being developed and are particularly active, I think, in the UK and Europe. The other thing that I'm seeing as part of the broader energy transition side of things is a continued focus on battery and storage, particularly costs, the increase in scale of battery and storage projects, but also that a number of regimes now are structured so that there are additional revenue streams. You can stack the revenues that you can derive from battery and storage assets, enabling sort of a better revenue flow, good revenue stacking, and there's now a real focus on asset optimization in that space.
Thank you. Great. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining. It's been a pleasure to host our second Japanese client-targeted seminar. So thank you for that. For those of you who aren't aware, so Miles will be relocating next month, hopefully, with the border reopening to Japan, and we look forward to welcoming him to Tokyo as part of the team here. But thank you everyone today, as I said. じゃあ皆さん、今日ご参加していただきまして、誠にありがとうございます。今日は、2本目のウェビナーなんですけれども、このシリーズの最後なんだけれども、また他の分野とかセミナーをアレンジしようと思っております。今日ありがとうございました。Thank you, everyone.